Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursalin. Assalamu alaikum. I thank the organizers of this colloquium for the invitation. And what I want to try to achieve tonight is to show you how a text was attributed for many years to somebody and in fact belongs to somebody else, and how some elements happened in the history of that text that led to a fake attribution, but this fake attribution could only occur because Avicenna was already a great authority, but on the other hand, the attribution itself of that text to Avicenna contributed even more to his fame, although the real author of that text disappeared, was forgotten about, and the real attribution of that text makes that text even more important and more interesting than when we consider it is attributed to Avicenna. And the text is in fact a manuscript which you have the privilege of keeping in the Fayzullah, the collection at the Bayazid Library in Istanbul, under the number 1217. It's 181 folios long, and it's called An-Nukat wal-Fawaid, important poems and useful remarks. After a brief prologue of one folio, this philosophical summa is divided into three parts: a logic part consisting of 10 maslak, ways, 5 fans or fields of physics, and 7 fans of ilahiyat. It is concluded by a short rule and recommendation, kaydıdır wa wasiyya. And the text was studied firstly by the Jesuit Wilhelm Kutsch in this commemoration, Avicenna commemoration volume, published in Calcutta in 1965. Should have said on the other side, but no problem. And Kutsch was the first to pay attention to this manuscript that had been neglected by George Anawati and Yahya Michot, the two most important bibliographers of Avicenna. And Kutsch attributed the work to Avicenna and found that the work was quite close to the Isharat and to the Najat. And he dated the manuscript to 1112 or 1113 of the Hijra, corresponding to 1700 or 1701 of the Common Era. And he edited the longest and last of the 5 sections of the Tabi'iyat physics, Fil Nufus, the psychology. And after Kutsch, the next most important academic study of the manuscript, Fayzullah 1217, was the doctoral dissertation submitted in December 1957 to the University of Tübingen in Germany by another Jesuit, the Italian Paul Werns. And this dissertation included a handwritten transcription of the title page, the introduction, the fans 1, 2, 3 of the Divinalia, and the conclusion of the work, as well as their translation into German. The poor availability of the Calcuttan article of Kutsch and the fact that Werns' dissertation remained unpublished probably explains why the Nukat wal-Fawaid was almost never used in Avicennan studies of the last decades of the 20th century. In 1997, Joseph Kenny, a third Jesuit, republished and translated into English selected passages of the Psychology edited some 40 years earlier by Kuch. And as Kenny's study appeared in Orita, a Nigerian journal, it did not really improve the situation, and Al-Nukad wal-Fawaid was not really used more after his article than before. Myself, I became interested in Al-Nukad wal-Fawaid in 2002-2003, and I felt quite enthusiastic about that work because there were so many similarities that were manifest between the text edited by Kuch and different texts by Avicenna, like the Isharat, the Psychology of the Shifa, but also the Compendium on the Soul written by Avicenna when he was still in Bukhara, the Ta'liqat of Avicenna, and his Risala al-Hawiyya. We had in Al-Nukad wal-Fawaid, in the psychology part of it, the most amazing text combining, among other elements, reworked pages of a work written by Avicenna before the age of 18, while he was still in Bukhara, and variations on chosen passages of his notes, his Ta'liqat, and what appeared to be a first version of long sections of the Summa, considered by some as one of his last books, the Isharat. And when you compare those texts of the Isharat and of Nukad wal-Fawaid, the common elements and differences between those texts become obvious. I will only refer here to this second element, for example, between the Ta'liqat and Nukat. If you read those two texts in relation to each other, you see that, of course, we have a reworked version of the Ta'liqat in the Nukat. And it is the case for so many other elements of the Nukat wal-Fawaid. And my enthusiasm about Nukad wal-Fawaid grew even more when, in May 2003, I was allowed to examine the manuscript here in Istanbul, and I realized then that the thick, slightly brownish rag paper was obviously an old Oriental paper. This fact, as well as the regularity and quality of the dotted and vocalized Nasr script, sufficed to undermine the dating of 1112, 1113 Hijri that Kuch had proposed. We had there a manuscript that was far older than the 18th century. Moreover, as had in fact already been noticed by Werens, this date that Kuch had given to the manuscript was no other than the date that you saw that can be found on folio number 1 on the Waqf stamp of the Sheikh al-Islam Faizullah Effendi. You have here the date 1112 or 1113, and it is this date of the Waqf stamp that Kuch had utilized to date the manuscript. It was completely wrong. The paper itself was much older than the date of the Waqf. And myself, I would date this codex of the 7th century Hijri or 13th century Hijri, Masiri. This early date of the Faizullah manuscript of Nukad wal-Fawaid made it an even more important manuscript than what I had thought until then. And thank God I was able to obtain a complete photographic CD-ROM of the manuscript. And then, as I had received, thanks to the mediation of some friends like Borjan Sherolu and Kosek Alaya, and thanks to the generosity of the director of the Suleymania, Dr. Nevzat Kaya, whom I am very thankful to, I was able to see clearly the general structure of that manuscript and its 3 parts, starting with the logic, which is completely parallel to the logic of the Isharat. It has the Tedmatslak exactly as the logic of the Isharat had 10 badge, and the titles are quite similar. The similarity between the Nukat and the Najat would seem to continue beyond the logic, as the titles of the 2 first fan of the physics echo those of the first and second namats of the Isharat. But this impression is in fact misleading, as the division of the work in 2 main distinctive parts after logic, physics and ilahiyat, divinalia, is itself absent from the Isharat. Moreover, with fans 3 and 4 of the physics, the link with the Isharat is completely severed. It is indeed of the pages of the Najat relating to these subjects that extensive and illuminating variations are now proposed. As for the composite nature of the 5th and last fan of the physic, the souls, I have already mentioned how composite it is. On the whole, the order and content of the fan 2 to 6 of the Ilahiyat of Nukat wal Fawaid, the 3rd part, so the fan 2 to 6 of Nukat wal Fawaid illustrate a return to the Isharat as they correspond to those of its namats 4 to 8. I have not yet been able to link the first fan of the Ilahiyat, summaries and syntheses, to any particular Avicennan writing. As for the 7th and last fan of the Ilahiyat of Nukat wal Fawaid, it is entitled The Establishment of Prophethood, the States of the Prophets, and the Secret of the Signs, the Prodigies of the Friends of God, the States of the Knowers, Ahwal al-Arifin, and of the Inspired One, wal-Mulhamin, the Masters in Magics and Talismans, the way to differentiate between these people, and the answering of invocations. As the namats 9 and 10 of the Isharat are entitled The Stations of the Knowers, Maqamat al-Arifin, and the Secrets of the Signs, the link could be considered obvious. There, the effective relation between the 2 works is, however, very tenuous. On the one hand, as the title of this 7th fan makes clear, its main object is prophetology, nubuwat. We therefore have a situation which is in fact the opposite of what Avicenna does in the last 2 sections of the Isharat. In the last 2 sections of the Isharat, prophetology is an element of a broader philosophy of Gnostic spirituality. In Nukat wal Fawaid, we have the inverse situation. Prophetology is itself the general doctrine of which a philosophy of Irfan develops as a particular part. On the other hand, the literal content of this last fan has in fact very little in common with the 2 last namats of the Isharat. The composite nature of Nukat wal Fawaid, already noticed in its chapter on psychology, indeed reappears in a most flagrant manner in the last section of the work. In fact, we have there pages of the Shifa, Metaphysics, Book 10, most of the 13th chapter of the Risala fi Ahwal al-Nafs, most of the epistle on the action and passion, Risalat al-Fi'al wal-Infi'al, a few lines from the beginning of the 9th namat of the Isharat, and 2 passages of the Ta'liqat. So again, this chapter is of a very, very composite nature. And my systematic comparison between Avicenna's works and Nukat wal Fawaid is far from being achieved. But the multiplicity and heterogeneity of the connections already identified between them, the frequent linguistic virtuosity apparent in the variations on or alternative versions of these writings, as well as their far-reaching philosophical implications, all contribute to make النكت والفوائد the most amazing and extraordinary text of Avicennan falsafa I have ever come across. Just think of the consequences of the wide-ranging transtextuality of this book for the questions of the chronology of the Sheikh al-Rai's corpus, the evolution of his thought, and in particular, a proper understanding of the Isharat. There is, however, a very little problem. النكت والفوائد are not a book of Avicenna. They are not. The real author of the book regularly refers to and strongly criticizes two persons he does not name but calls Sheikh al-Yahud, the Sheikh of the Jews, and Hashawi al-Ajim, the padder or humbug of verbose one among the non-Arabs. The two expressions are found in the psychology part edited by Koch. You have them here. كما ظنه شيخ اليهود وشنع به في خطابته وتبعه حشو العاجم في زماننا. And so the real author criticized somebody called Sheikh al-Yahud, and also another one he calls fi zamanina, in our time, meaning it's a contemporary, somebody calls Hashawi al-Ajim. Koch didn't give any attention to this fact. Kenny, in fact, doesn't select the passages in which those two terms appear, so he avoids them. As for Wernst, he simply declares in a footnote that die Identität dieses jüdischen Meisters ist unbekannt, so it's unknown. Elsewhere, he explained the meanings of Hashawi and Ajim, but does not give any clue about the possible identity of the thinker alluded to. If Wernst had included in his doctoral research 2 more chapters of the metaphysics of النكت والفوائد, he would certainly have realized that himself, as in its 5th fan, in a passage paraphrasing a hikayah of the 7th namat of the Isharat, one reads this. So, what do we read? This is the passage of the Isharat, and that's the passage of the Nukat. Beware of preoccupying yourself with that which Porphyry of Tyre, a Suri, said about this in ancient times in his book on the intellect and the intelligibles, and that which the Sheikh of the Jews says in modern times in his books which would deserve to be called the book of the examples not to be followed, Kitab al-Ibad, not the book of what has been established by personal reflection, Kitab al-Mu'tabar. To preoccupy oneself with such ideas is indeed corrupting for the mind. So, the Kitab al-Mu'tabar referred to in this passage is, of course, the main work of the famous philosopher and critic of Avicenna, Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi, who probably died in 1164-1165. A Jew by birth, Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi converted to Islam in his old age. The fact that he is nevertheless called the Sheikh of the Jews in النكت والفوائد should not come as a surprise. As-Suhrawardi, for example, also mentioned his Jewish origin when he attacks him in his Kitab al-Mashari' wal-Mutarahat. And many of the passages of النكت والفوائد where the Sheikh of the Jews is attacked could be quoted here, and it should theoretically be possible to link them all to specific pages of the Kitab al-Mu'tabar. I give 2 examples here. I will only refer to one now. When you look at physics span 2, speaking about Earth being colder than water because it is denser and density is a necessary concomitant of coldness, you have exactly the source in the Kitab al-Mu'tabar. And for all the attacks of the Nukat wal-Fawaid against the Sheikh of the Jews, you can find parallels in the Kitab al-Mu'tabar of Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi. So, of course, Avicenna can naturally not be the author of a work criticizing a thinker born one generation after his death. This being the case, what one has got to make of the mention of the name Ibn Sina on the title page of the manuscript Fayzullah 1217. And that's the most interesting part. This is what you have on the title page of the manuscript Fayzullah. You have Kitab al-Nukat wal-Fawaid, and then you read إنشاء مولانا علامة العالم أفضل المتأخرين شرف الدنيا والدين محصول نهاية العقول سينا ابن سينا إمام الأمة أتم الأئمة, then it's not readable, أن تعلم المسلمين ببقائه. And that's what you have on the title page of the manuscript. And in fact, we have there a serious problem, as some words of the rhymed prose sajja of the incipit have been deliberately smudged and erased at an indefinite moment of the history of the manuscript. Koch did not say anything on the subject. As for Wegans, he conjectured that the deleted words were titles honoring Avicenna, whose Shiite connotation must have displeased some theological censorship in the Sunni Istanbul, where the manuscript had finally been set as a waqf. He therefore translated the title and incipit in the way you have the translation there in German, and Sina ibn Sina, you have Sina ibn Sina, he translated as the Erhabenheit des Ibn Sina. So he made it a title, an honorific title of Ibn Sina, that could be translated into English as the resplendence of Avicenna, i.e. the most splendid illustration of manifestation of Avicenna. In fact, this rhymed expression is not honoring the Sheikh al-Rais, but is a title conferred, just like the other titles preceding or following it, to the person whose names originally came after Imams, but were deleted later on. And in fact, the name of the real author of the book is there and there, but it cannot be read anymore because it has really been smudged. And another sign that Avicenna is not the author of An-Nukat wal-Fawaid can be found in the logic of the work, where the philosopher is referred to as Azim al-Fudala, the greatest of the eminence, in relation to two of his minor works on logic. The greatest of the eminence says in the book Al-Awsat, or the greatest of the eminences has made that clear in his epistles on the conversion of the model propositions, Risala fi Uquz Dawat al-Jihad. All the expectations, hopes and hypotheses one could have attached to the Avicennan authenticity of An-Nukat wal-Fawaid, affirmed by Koch, reaffirmed by Wens and Kenny, have obviously vanished by now. First result of this research is don't trust the Jesuits, especially when they speak of Avicenna. And those were 3 Jesuits, and they were all lying or telling stupidities about the authorship of that book. So, approach from new perspectives, I mean the destiny of Avicennism after Avicenna, and also the impact of Abu al-Barakat's often very original ideas on later falsafa, the book nevertheless continues to present the greatest interest. At this moment, the question of the identity of the real author cannot yet be addressed, all the more as we still do not know when he calls Hashawi al-Ajim. In the parts of his work which I have systematically studied until now, the author of An-Nukat wal-Fawaid does nowhere disclose the identity of the Hamburg of the non-Arabs as he does with the Sheikh of the Jews. On the basis of various passages in which he refers to him, one particular name only nevertheless comes to the mind, Fakhruddin al-Razi. If we look, for example, at this passage, which I give here in a long translation, we have that, so from An-Nukat wal-Fawaid, we have this affirmation: existence is added, Za'id ala, the essence of God Most High. That's a doctrine which is typical of Fakhruddin al-Razi. And all the other passages in which there is a reference to the Hashawi al-Ajim, we are able, but it will take a long time, we should be able, I think, to find some parallelism with Fakhruddin al-Razi's books, among them Al-Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya. In Al-Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya, for example, Fakhruddin al-Razi says, we have proved that the existence of the Most High is added to his quiddity, and that his quiddity is the cause of that existence and described by it. A follower of Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi who attacked Avicenna on a number of issues, and who, among other non-Avicennan views, thought that existence is added to the essence of God, these various elements fit perfectly with what is widely known of the main source and nature of the great Ash'ari theologian's ideas, as well as of the way he opposed them against the doctrine of the Shaykh al-Rais. The identification of al-Razi as the Hashawi al-Ajim will of course have to be confirmed by linking each of the passages of An-Nukat wal-Fawaid in which he is attacked with some pages of his writings, and also with pages of the Mu'tabar when he is said to follow the Sheikh of the Jews, and also of the Isharat or other Avicennan texts, again which his own views were developed. At this stage, the identification already helps to explain and is somehow supported by two following factors. First, the very harsh manner in which the Hamburg of the non-Arabs is regularly condemned in An-Nukat wal-Fawaid, religion-wise as well as from a philosophical point of view, particularly suits a personality like al-Razi, who is himself notorious for his animosity and lack of pity in the debates and controversies into which he loved to drag his contemporaries. Secondly, to the ear of someone acquainted with al-Razi's corpus, the rhymed expression, the produce of the extreme point reached by the intellect, mahsul nihayat al-uqul, which you have on the title pages of An-Nukat wal-Fawaid, when you read here, mahsul nihayat al-uqul, that's a pun, it's a direct or implicit, if you want, reference to a very well-known work of Fakhruddin al-Razi, al-Mahsul fi ilm usul al-fiqh, wa nihayat al-uqul fi dirayat al-usul. So we can see that even at that point there is probably, most probably, a reference to Fakhruddin al-Razi as well. So who wrote An-Nukat wal-Fawaid? As the author of An-Nukat wal-Fawaid speaks of the Hamburg of the non-Arabs as someone of his time, fi zamanina, you saw earlier, it could perhaps be useful to take this expression in its narrowest and most literal sense, which would result in him being a contemporary of al-Razi himself. So bets are open. Personally, I could somehow be tempted to suggest that An-Nukat wal-Fawaid is an early work of Shihab ad-Din Abu al-Futuh Yahya bin Habash bin Amirak Suhrawati, the famous Ishwarati thinker martyrized in Aleppo in 1191. Sohrawardi was the fellow student of Fakhreddin Razi in Maraghe when he attended the courses of Majd-ed-Din al-Jili, but seems to have had reservations about the philosophical abilities of the Ash'ari theologian. As already remarked, he also attacks Abu al-Barakat in his Kitab al-Mashari' wal-Mutarahat. Sohrawardi then blames the Jewish philosopher for attributing to the necessary existence infinitely renewed wills, antecedently and subsequently. He calls him a filthy madman, al-Majnun al-Qadir, and denounces his impudence, jasara, as well as the intensity with which he engaged in such things about God. No, I quote, because a researcher is a human being, it is no wonder that he makes mistake. As for refusing the patent truth, as does Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi, in the opinion of Sohrawardi, this is inexcusable. As Sohrawardi's debt toward Avicenna is common knowledge and remains enormous even when he moves away from Avicenna and develops his Oriental wisdom beyond the teachings of the Sheikh Raids. The way some of the texts by his hands embroider an essentially Avicennan canvas demonstrate both an interest for the kind of philosophical exercise also illustrated by Nukat wal-Fawaid and the expertise necessary to make it a success. One should also notice that the internal organization of the topics covered in the ilahiyat of this work is not without similarity to the table of contents of Sohrawardi's book, At-Talwihat. Of course, none of these things is a proof that Nukat wal-Fawaid is a work of the Sheikh Ali Sharar. And trying to identify the author whose name was deleted from the incipit of the manuscript Faizullah 1217 is in fact premature. Some might be disappointed that this is not an Avicennan work. Myself, I consider that although the identity of the real author is not yet completely confirmed, I must confess that I remain amazed by its very unusual nature and by the extraordinary interest it has for the history of Islamic philosophical thought after Avicenna. For the many parts of the Isharat with which it has links, and Nukat wal-Fawaid constitutes a commentary that is as early as Razi's one, and perhaps even earlier than the Sharh al-Isharat of Razi, and that this commentary here is positively minded towards Avicenna, as much positively minded towards Avicenna as Fakhreddin Razi's Sharh al-Isharat is opposed to Avicenna. It could also reveal a far better understanding of Avicenna than Tusi's Sharh al-Isharat, as this later commentator often pursues his own doctrinal agenda. In the Qaida wa Wasiyya that concludes his work, the author of Nukat wal-Fawaid criticizes sharply, beside the ignoramuses and the philosophers unable to discover esoteric truths, those who discard religious laws and despise the founders of the religions. Earlier on, I briefly mentioned the way he departs from the two last namats of the Isharat in order to focus on the basis of other Avicennan writings on prophetology rather than on Irfan. Was this a kind of corrective process the Isharat had to be submitted to in order to be able to exert its full influence among religiously minded intellectuals and be opposed by them as an ideal antidote to philosophies that were far less favorable to the prophets and the religions? The question remains open. But whatever the answer to such a question, I would argue that Nukat wal-Fawaid opens a new, original, golden way to explore the various dimensions taken around the end of the 12th century by the debates on logic, physics, metaphysics, theology, prophetology, etc., as inspired by the philosophical corpus of the greatest of the eminent, Afdal al-Fudala, and as animated, among other important Muslim thinkers, by a Sheikh of the Jews, an Arab Hamburg, and a mysterious Sana ibn Sina. We have then, with النكت والفوائد, the confirmation of the importance of Avicenna for the young Suhrawardi. How deeply Avicennan the young Suhrawardi was before he became himself Isharaqi. And Avicenna was such a classical reference that people who wanted to become famous had in some way to depart, to move away from him at some point in their career. But even when they moved away, what they had written in the early period of their life, like is the case, I think, here with the young pre-Isharaqi Suhrawardi, remained and was so Avicennan that at some point it became attributed to Avicenna, not only by 3 Jesuits, but also by people who didn't hesitate in modifying the incipit of the manuscript and did not hesitate in forgetting about the real author to attribute the work to Avicenna. It's a fantastic case of, I would say, changing the course of history in some way. You perhaps remember those photographs of Soviet Union when Stalin asked the photograph to be redrawn in some way so that Trotsky would not appear on the photograph anymore. Here, at some point, we have some Muslim author making the name of Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, who had been executed, Shar'an, made it disappear to the benefit of Avicenna. Thank you.